Hello. Hello guys, and welcome to the MSC Performance Podcast with me, Mark Coulson. Today I'm joined by
the saviour, Luke Rogers.
El Saviour. It's been a while. How are we doing?
Numbers are down. I'm coming in to bring it back up. I'm good, man. I'm good. It's been a while, so I'm excited now to get stuck into a podcast now that the gyms are actually open, because I think the last time was pretty much just as we were about to open. So looking forward to getting into one now, very much training related, that people can take some good points away, and looking forward to getting stuck into one.
Absolutely. Without further ado, we'll crack on. So today we're going to be talking about exercise selection and load management. Do you want to just expand on that for the viewers and listeners, Lee?
Sure. Last week's Q&A, we had a couple of people asking questions about like how we choose exercises for people on an individual basis, because that's one thing that we pride ourselves on for like the Barbell Club, and obviously for personal coaching as well. And I think some people don't quite understand how we select exercises, and maybe don't fully understand the individuality process. They might think it's going to look completely different than it actually is, because a lot of times people think individual program and it's 1,000 random exercises that are completely different to the next person's, which is not what the individuality process is. So I want to get stuck into that today, kind of talk about how we individualize on a macrocycle, so on a week basis, on a mesocycle, block to block, and then also the picture overall and kind of like the natural progressions that we see through the blocks. Like I said, the individuality part, so what kind of characteristics we take into account when we're individualizing a program for people, and just everything that's to do with programming and also managing training load. So
fantastic. So when we're working for a training cycle, we'll look at a 16-week macro with the Barbell Club. Obviously that is individual. If we're working with private clients who are competing in events and stuff, that'll be different, but we've got that overall macro. The meso we're working 4-week blocks, and then the micro we're talking sort of week to week. And in regards to today's podcast, we'll talk refer to day to day as well. So where do we start in regards to exercise selection and how the average strength and conditioning session will look? We're looking at basically following a pattern of a squat, a hinge, a push, a pull, and a carry, or a core exercise. So that's the kind of basic rule of thumb, but there is some individuality within that. So
yeah, sure. So when we have when we start with someone for the Barbell Club, like Mark said, where they're looking for a good all-round strength and conditioning program, we will have set places on the program, so everyone's doing the same program, but then the individuality comes in the little details that we apply to that. So on a Monday, for example, everyone is squatting, everyone's doing some pushing, everyone's doing a pull. The squat is what is individualized, and we individualize this based on several different characteristics. So we're looking at people's ability to actually perform exercises, which is a combination of motor control and mobility. Some people just physically can't get into a good back squat position. Some people can't get into a good deadlift position. Other people just have that ability, or they've trained for a while and have the motor control and have the movement qualities necessary to get into these good positions. So that's the first thing that we take into account, is people's actual abilities to perform the lifts. The next thing we kind of look at is like their tolerance to training stress, which comes and links massively to training age as well. So for people that haven't trained much, their tolerance is going to be quite low to training volume. So it's something that we can progressively build up. And with the exercise selections, we can choose things that are either more stressful or less stressful based off kind of how they're reporting their individualized stress levels. So we often use a feedback form, as well as talking to people on a daily, and looking at the training, which is the most important thing, and their performance in the training is the most important thing that we keep an eye on. But also just like how sore they're feeling session to session, how sore they're feeling at the end of the week, how well they're enjoying the sessions, and just overall how they're reporting that the training stress is. And then we can change the exercises based off there. So for some people, they might say that the training stress is incredibly high. And if that's the case and they're incredibly sore, we can scale it back and choose exercises that are slightly less stressful, and that would typically be exercises that use less weight. For example, a good morning compared to a stiff leg deadlift is a very similar hinge pattern, but a good morning, because of the weight that's lifted, is going to be less stressful, all things taken into account and all things average. So we try and take that into account, and if training stress needs to be ramped up, we can change from a good morning to a stiff leg deadlift, or vice versa if they're reporting that the stress and the training soreness, etc., is too high. So that's some of the individuality that we take into account. And then the last one is Anthropometrics, which massively links into like their ability to get into positions. but then also take into account that people that are taller aren't going to lift as many repetitions compared to shorter people on average, just because of distance traveled, and also the amount of work they're going to do compared to someone that's shorter is going to be so much more as well. When you're taking into account the distance traveled, Mark is going to work harder on a squat than me. He's going to achieve more work if we both did 100 for a set of 5. The amount of work Mark's doing compared to myself, because I'm 5'1" and Mark's 7'3", the difference is going to be massive. So we take that into account as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like this is strength conditioning and coaching in a nutshell, isn't it? Is that individuality, the tracking, the feedback aspect as well. So we'll always start off with a bit of an induction session where we get people to do like very basic movement patterns. We'll look at the squat, we'll look at the hinge. You know, can they get into a good hinge position? You know, if they can't, then probably loading up a Romanian deadlift is not going to be the best option for them. You know, so it's, you know, finding out all those kind of things that we talked about: motor control, mobility, anthropometrics, you know, training age tolerance, etc. And then we can build from there. But then it's also, as Luke's just said, like, you know, very important to get the feedback ongoing as we go along there. And it might take a little bit of tweaking, but
Absolutely.
It's working towards that right training program.
What I typically would like to see when you're looking at the individuality process is not changing things too frequently if you can avoid it. Still being open to being proactive and change things as and when you need to, but giving things to kind of have a chance to play out. Exactly. Give things 4 weeks, and if at the end of a 4-week block, if you say, look, training stress is super low and I'm not sore, then we can turn the training stress up at the end of a block. One thing I'm against is just trying to make too many changes at once. You start to lose out if you know like what is working, what isn't. So we try and give things a chance to go, but obviously as well being proactive and reacting to things that pop up kind of in the feedback as well. Yeah.
Every movement that you do in the gym is a skill, and if you're jumping and hopping between movements too often, then it doesn't give you a chance to actually develop the skill. 4-week blocks works quite nicely. It's a good amount of time for most people where we can sort of really figure out if that's the right movement for them. It gives them the chance to learn the technique and get better. I've had a client start recently. The first week or two was a real struggle to get into a hip hinge pattern and do a particular movement, and then we stuck at it a couple more weeks and then it clicked, and then all of a sudden we've not just written that movement off forever, we've actually learned it. It just took a little bit longer than sometimes it would otherwise, and then we've got that movement in the locker now forever, and we can build on that. So
with that client, like you just said, now that he can do an RDL, which is fantastic, at the end of a 4-week block, if you say, oh man, he's moving fantastically well, he's increased his strength X amount, you know that it's because of the RDL. But if you change from an RDL to a good morning to a stiff leg deadlift to a hyper, you've no idea what's kind of giving you the result that you're after. So I think with the individual process as well, trying to find what works, not adjusting things for the sake of them, and allowing them to kind of progress through a block is a good way to find out what works. And if after 4 weeks you see no progression, or he's not feeling any stronger, then maybe that's a movement that doesn't work for that individual. And like you said, you can write it off, or you can say that's now in the toolbox for another day. So it's good to kind of let things play it and see if they're working for your overarching goal, which would typically be for most people to get stronger.
Yeah, to not panic, to not overreact, to give a little bit of time, and let's see if we can actually learn the skill. Let's not jump from exercise to exercise all of the time. As you say, 4 weeks is enough time to generally learn the skill, build a bit of load, and create a stress and stimulus, basically, which is obviously what we're looking to do.
Big time. So I think with the individuality, again, it's just really important to say that it's not about having a completely different program to the next person, which is, I think a lot of people when say, oh, I've got an individual program, would expect. So like my program's going to be completely different to everyone else's. The individuality comes down to those little minutiae details, like managing your training stress, adjusting the repetitions and sets compared to someone else, taking into account, like we said, taller people on average lift less than shorter people, taking into account your training age, taking into account your load tolerance. These are the small things that change and are part of the individual process, versus like a complete overhaul and a completely different program, so a black and white program compared to someone else's. I think that's really important to know, because I think people expect a mad random program that the thing's personalised to them, and it would be for the sake of it if that was the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think lifestyle's important as well, isn't it? In terms of what that person's doing in the day to day, what the job entails, what the stress levels are like, etc., etc.
Definitely. When you're looking at sessions and trying to get a good understanding of what people's weeks are like, and if it's consistent on a week by week basis, or if they have shift patterns, or if they're they go through even if they're students and then having periods of time where they've got exams and things are more stressful, and the effect that can have on training and adjusting things from there is also a really important thing.
Yeah, just a little tweak in an exercise, like you say, can just reduce the stress a little bit. So let's say if we're going through a stressful period, or it's getting harder to come into the gym and we're under more stress, more fatigue, like you say, we can still keep a hip hinge pattern, but you might switch from a Romanian deadlift to a good morning. At a higher end level, you might take the belt off, for example, to reduce the load, or whatever it might be. So it's just playing around with these little tweaks as we go along, really. But as I said before, like the key is that that interaction, that feedback, the communication aspect of it is just so important, really.
The individuality thing is definitely a two-way street, and the feedback that you give is so important at any level. The other week I had to report back to my coach and say that I found the training stress just a little bit too much, and I was almost dreading doing the last set of deadlifting. But without that feedback, the coach doesn't know, and you can try and put a front on it and pretend that everything's absolutely fine. But if you're finding things too hard, the individuality is a two-way street, and you need to give that feedback back. And vice versa, if you find the training incredibly easy and say, look, I want to push on a little bit more, let your coach know so that they can increase that training stress for you. And like you just said, not going from a massive change, just like a small change over time, maybe increasing training stress by 10% or a set, rather than doubling the amount of sets, just being smart with the progressive plan.
So I had a client start recently for some one-on-one work, and he came in for the first session and was like, oh, so what's the training program? What have we got? Oh, we've got a diet plan. Do you give out a diet plan? And obviously the purpose of this podcast isn't a nutrition-based one, but I'll use an example where he was expecting just a template, diet plan to go, right, here you go. And it's like, well, okay, what do we do with that? If I write, if I've got something prepared like that, and it's 2,000 calories a day and 120 grams of protein, a day, and I just give that to him, it's like, well, actually, I don't know anything about this guy. We've got to get to know him. I've got to know what he's eating at the moment. If I, give him that, and he's currently eating 3,800 calories a day, and I'm giving him a plan for 2,000 calories, it's like I'm almost cutting in half what he's eating, and that just isn't going to be sustainable in the slightest. So, we might lose some pounds in the first week, and then it's like, I can't go on like this. I can't move. I can't function. So I'm going to start eating crap and get my calories back up, and it just doesn't work. So it's like, well, it's that feedback and that constant interaction aspect where it's like, right, okay, well, I want you to, I want you to track for a week at least. I mean, that's the bare minimum, but track for a week everything everything you're eating, your calorie intake, etc., etc. And it's like, right, okay, you're having 3,800 calories. No problem. Great. Okay, the guy wants to lose some weight. Okay, let's knock off 15% off of that total, and we're gonna have 3,500 calories. I'm gonna see how that goes, and then we're gonna, how's your training stress going? Is it, are the sessions too much? Are they too little? Can we push a bit more? If we can, maybe we can alter the calories accordingly as well. And it's the same with the training program. Is like, okay, if I've written that up before, it's, and I've got belt squat in there, it's not like belt squat's going to be the miracle exercise that's going to help this guy lose weight. But once I've seen him move, and then I see, he's really struggling to get into a back squat position, or, he's just anthropometrically is well suited to a belt squat, for example, then that might be the right exercise. We've got to have a look at him first. So we're going to test some squat patterns, we're going to test some hinge, some push, some pull, we're going to do some sort of core or carry test, and then we can go from there. We can build, and sometimes it takes a session, and even with this guy, it was a full week really of just looking at various different movements, and then it's like, right, okay, now we've done that, now we've had some nutritional feedback, bang, here's the program, but it's individualized towards him, but it's only individualized because we've got to know him, see where he's at, and we go from there.
It's funny that you say about him coming in and asking for training programs straight away, because to me that's a massive red flag. When if I went in and started with a coach, I'll read your training program up, and they know nothing about me, or he knows that
I've never seen him.
Yeah, he knows that I want to powerlift. He's like, I'll read your powerlifting program up. It's like, well, you don't know my training history, you don't know how many sets I usually do, you don't know how much stress I currently have. I guess this is different because the guy, from what I understand, had a bit of a layoff. But if your coach or you're starting and they've just given you a set program, a set diet plan, taking nothing into account, that's a massive red flag, because the individuality comes down to like your training history, how much stress you can actually tolerate. Because there's so many programs online that you can do for free, which work absolutely fine. If you're paying money for an individual program, this is what you're paying for the individuality. You're still going to be doing a program that might look very similar to a set templated program online, but the individuality comes down to, the exercise selection, the training stress, the amount of sets you're accumulating. That's the part that's individualized. And if you're getting a set program straight away from a coach and he said, this is a program that you should do, it's fantastic. It's the same for every single person. They're not taking into account your individual needs, and that's what the difference is.
That's it. Yeah, exactly. It's like, well, here's a 12-week shred program or something like that. It's like, well, again, you don't know the thing. You don't know anything about me. You don't know what my job entails, the stresses outside of the gym. How many times, I might be saying I can come to the gym 5 times a week, and after a week you realise I can only come twice.
Harry and Bob might sign up for the 12-week shred, and Harry's doing, he's currently doing 20 sets a week of legs and lower body training, and Bob's currently doing 10 sets. And if the training program is 20 sets, then Harry might do great. Bob's going to do absolutely terrible, and he's going to feel disgusting because he's doubled his training volume. You're not taking into account their prior training history, so it's going to be very different responses.
Yeah.
So in an ideal world, if Bob and Harry signed up for a program, they should take into account that I've only been doing 10 sets, he's been doing 20. So let's adjust that, and let's adjust their training volume accordingly to their prior history and what they can tolerate.
And with it, again, just to touch upon the nutrition again, like it's like, okay, here's a plan with 1,000 calories or 2,000 calories, and this is, you've got to eat A, B, C, D, and E. Like, you've got to eat these food types. I mean, if we're massively restricting ourselves and eating things that we don't like, it's not going to last, is it? Like, with human beings, like to, there's certain things we like and don't like, lifestyles, etc., to take into account. And again, if I'm saying, right, you can only eat chicken and rice for the rest of your life, it's just not going to happen, is it? So again, it's like that. Keep talking about it, but that feedback is so important. Of like, even your clients say, "Oh, bloody hell, I've blown it again. I've gone out on the weekend." And then as a coach, you start to see that's a regular pattern. And okay, it's not ideal, and it does make life very difficult. But we can at least try and adjust during the week and mitigate the damage. Yes, absolutely. So
you're eating 800 calories Monday to Friday, then 7,000 Saturday and Sunday. Average out.
Hell of a week. Hanging on for dear life, and then going for broke at the weekend. It probably wraps up the micro type stuff, I think.
I think the main takeaway is when you're looking at the microcycle is you're going to be doing programs that look fairly similar if you just looked from an outside looking in, but then looking at the smaller details, and that's kind of where the individuality comes into it. So
even me and you competing in completely different sports, we'd be working around that rule of thumb of squat, hinge, push, pull.
The application is very different what me and Mark do, but the exercise selection is fairly similar. We both bench, we both do some kind of squat, and we both do some kind of deadlifting. I don't sprint, I will say that, but there are lots of
some of the conditioning aspects might be a little bit different, but generally speaking, like, we're going to be doing a squat pattern. Luke will be back squatting, all year round pretty much, and that's obviously essential because the sport, involves a back squat. For me, if I'm not back squatting, it's not the end of the world. I can be doing a different, I can be doing a front squat, I can be doing a belt squat, I can be doing a goblet squat, or I can be doing a landmine squat. I've got lots, there's lots of variations in which I can do, but I'm still squatting. Same with hip hinge. I might be doing heavy RDLs. Luke might be doing good mornings because his deadlift volumes, through the roof, and squats through the roof at certain periods. He might back off an RDL and go into a good morning, or a single leg variation, a split stance, etc., etc. So it's all general rule of thumb. Just slight differences in terms of the type of exercise, the type of squat, type of hinge, etc. Luke will do some single leg, I'll do some single leg. I might do some more because of the sport that I play. Yours is a bilateral sport. Mine's the unilateral, but we still both need to do the other. But the amount that we're doing might just be a little bit different. Yeah,
absolutely.
So that, as I say, that probably caps up the sort of micro stuff. So session to session, and looking at a training week. So what about the meso? We're talking about a 4-week block now.
again, just to reiterate that if you were like fully individualized programming, it doesn't have to be a 4-week. And I have some clients that vary from a 3-week meso up to a 7-week meso, and that's a very individualized thing. And again, that comes with time of working with someone, understanding kind of how long they can tolerate training for, and kind of when they reach that peak performance per se. So for some people, after 3-4 weeks, that they find that just the training for that amount of time is enough, where they start to need a deload, they're starting maybe to get a couple of niggles, training stress is high risk of injury. For other people, they feel that they can push on for 5-6 weeks. We use 4 weeks as an example for today because that's what we use with the Barbell Club, so it makes sense to talk about it from that respect. So yeah, with the 4-week block, we typically start with a introduction week, and we don't particularly use deloads, but we want to talk about deloads as well. So an introduction week and deload, they're fairly similar, but they're like brother and sister rather than completely different. An introduction week, I see as setting yourself up to increase your potential and your performances in future weeks. Your deload week is just to fully facilitate recovery. So they both start with lower volume, they both start with typically slightly less intensity. So there's some similarities, but I think the introduction week is about setting yourself up for success in future blocks, while a deload week might not necessarily be to reach peak performance in the next week or two. It could be just to fully recover from the previous training block. So do you think that's...
Yeah, absolutely. With the intro week as well, like you're generally bringing in new exercises or different exercises. So for a beginner or early intermediate who might not have done certain exercises, that'll be quite a heavy stimulus in itself.
Yeah.
So we might just back off with the volume might be quite moderate, the intensity might be quite moderate, because we're getting quite a good stimulus from a different movement pattern or different exercise. So for example, if we've got a beginner going from a good morning into an RDL, we don't really need to be pushing the volume and intensity that much, because the fact that it's a different movement pattern and we're naturally going to be probably loading up a little bit anyway, will be a significant stimulus to cause an adaptation. And even for a more advanced lifter, you are, because when we're looking to create stresses and stimulus, we look at volume, so the amount of work we're doing, look at intensity, the weights in which we're using, and we look at exercise selection as well. And sometimes just changing that exercise selection can build up a different stress and stimulus. So it's quite a nice, it's probably a little bit more stress than you would think. And like you say, with a deload, by the time you get to week 4, week 5, week 6, whatever it is, again we'll use 4 weeks as an example. You get to week 4, you've had 3 good weeks of using those exercises, so you use the exercise stimulus. So now it's just a case of backing off with the volume, potentially intensity, but we'll talk about that in a bit. But like backing off with the volume a little bit, so we're just bringing those stress levels down a bit.
This isn't going to work if you listen on Spotify, but if you imagine like the training is kind of on an uphill spike towards like week 4, which would typically be the hardest week, then the deload week on average would be maybe a cut of 30 to 50% of volume. So if you're doing 10 sets, you're going to do like 6, maybe 5 to 7 sets for that week. So you're reducing the amount of training volume. You might be dropping the intensity. Sometimes we hold it, sometimes we drop it by around like maybe only 10%. So it's predominantly the volume that we're dropping back. So we do this like massive step down, and then the introduction is almost like the step back to then start to build back up to the 2, 3, and 4. So the deload would be less than the introduction week, and the introduction week is just bridging that gap to then get back to your full amount of training stress, and then moving forward from weeks 2, 3, and 4. So an example would be like if you're typically doing 4 sets on a Monday for squats, your deload week you might only do 2 sets, and then for your introduction week you might do 3 sets, and then you're back into 4 sets on your full training block. So the deload is a half. We keep the intensity to maintain the skill and the stimulus as best as we can. The introduction week just builds up your tolerance to that volume, and then you're back in on week 2 of your next training block.
Yeah, exactly. It's like steps, or like a pyramid. Okay, sure. Think about a pyramid, like go step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and then we back off with a deload. So we're like say we're the intro week, we're setting the foundation. We're acquainting ourselves with new exercises, with little tweaks, and even experienced guys like ourselves are training like sometimes just tweaking those exercises and bringing in new things can create a bit of stimulus, as we say. But we're just setting the foundation there, and then we build to next week, probably adding a little bit more volume, adding a little bit of intensity, and then the same on week 3, week 4 deload, or week 5 deload, whenever it is. And we just again reduce the volume rather than the intensity, generally speaking.
Another thing to think about is with the introduction week is depending on what you were working on the previous block into the next one, you might be bridging the gap of like the reps. So if you're going from like a lower repetition block into a high repetition block, that introduction week can be used to kind of set you up for there. So if you're doing a block around 4 to 5 reps, and then your next block, you're looking to increase the amount of reps per set to around 7 to 8. Nothing creates DOMs more than a novel stimulus. So that could be through a new exercise, but it could also be through a novel rep scheme. So you, instead of going from 4s up to 8, and you're doubling the amount of reps per set, is going to be cause incredible DOMs. You might do 3x6, and then the next week you do 3x8. So it's a way of bridging that as well. It's a massive step, and it's a way, like Mark says, is to avoid the amount of DOMs that you would get from the novelty of a new exercise or a novel rep scheme. And yeah, you try and avoid that as much as you can and build up your tolerance to it. And then by the time you're into week 2 and you're up at 8, you'll still be a little bit sore, but you won't be as sore as if you jump from 4 to 8. So we're just trying to give you increased potential to get as much out of that week as you can and try and manage that training stress as much as possible.
Yeah, week 1 we're setting the foundations, aren't we? We're building a base, and then as we said, we can week on week then we can build, and then with the deload, generally we tend to reduce volume rather than intensity.
We try and keep intensity roughly the same, like I said, just to maintain, the skill, maintain the strength stimulus. We know that with strength, we need less amount of sets or reps to get as much of a strength stimulus. For the volume, hypertrophy is very much volume dependent. We try and get a little bit of a strength stimulus in, but drop that volume down. Then the intro week just to kind of bridge that gap and then progressively build it back up. With the rest of the cycle, what we typically try to achieve with the block, like what would be the progressions you would see week on week?
Yeah, within the meso?
Within a 4-week block for this example.
Yeah, so say like week 1 we're setting the foundation there, so it might be something simple like 3 sets of 6 with a different exercise. We're looking to jump from we've done the first block, we're maybe moving into the second block, and we're looking to accumulate both volume and intensity, for example. So we might look at 3 sets of 6 on the first week. Okay, so we've got a total of 18 reps, and then we want to increase volume and intensity. So we might be looking for let's say that's the back squat as an example. Then we might look in the next week of increasing both volume and intensity just very gradually. So we might look at something like 2 sets of 4, and then 2 sets of 8 or something like that, or 2 sets of 7 or 6. So we've got a couple of back off sets, so we can build up the intensity a little bit by doing a small amount of volume at higher intensity, so we can build a bit of strength and get used to that. But what we're doing there is we're adding a couple of back offset, what we call back offsets in. So we're doing lighter load but higher rep scheme, and then that will accumulate the volume. So get the best of both worlds of a gradual increase in intensity and a gradual increase of volume. And then there's different ways of doing it. On week 3, we might do the same again, or we might even reduce the volume. If we're looking at kind of old school Russian block training, we go big spike up on week 2. Week 3, we actually could reduce the volume and go quite heavy and build the intensity. Different ways of doing it.
Absolutely. I mean, the typical ways that we would do it, like I do enjoy that slight reduction in week 3 to then have a good push on week 4. But typically we would either see, like, let's say if we're in a strength orientated block, there would be like a natural drop off in terms of the repetitions as the block goes on. Yeah. So an example could be doing, like Mark said, sets of 5, week 1, week 2, week 3. Then week 4, you might just drop the reps down to 4. Just use it as a chance just to kind of test the strength a little bit more and see like how progression has been through the block. You might also increase RPE week on week, so you could keep the rep scheme the same and progress the RPE. Another way is just to keep the RPE and the rep scheme exactly the same and just kind of let the stimulus and let you adapt to the training program, and then just see progression of strength while holding all the other characteristics exactly the same. So there is no one set way of doing it. I do quite enjoy the natural drop off in terms of repetitions as well, just to kind of have a bit of a strength test. That also works very well for people if they're having it artificially enhances their strength training. So if you're finding that like week to week of holding the RPE and holding the reps, you're not seeing much progression. If you drop a rep down and keep everything else the same, so go from 3 6s, you might do that at 100 kilos. If you drop down to 3 5s and keep it at the same RPE, it would be 102 to 105. So it'd be a way of almost forcing progression if there's not much more progression to be made out of the block. Yeah. Again, that's a very individual thing. But
absolutely, it is individual, and it's based on experience a little bit as well and training age, isn't it? I think like ultimately what you're looking for is the minimal dosing like that you can to improve, and like making it as simple as possible really, and like just that progressive overload.
like I said, if you're trying to force progression, it might be a natural drop off. But for some people that are fairly new, progress should come really fast, and you won't have to play around with these variables quite as much just to see progression. If you're very new to training, you should be seeing easy jumps week on week, at least to begin with. The old newbie gains, which we miss very much so. Enjoy them while they last. So depending, again, training age would take that into account of like what you're looking from a week by week. But as a rule of thumb, we're looking for an increase in work intensity. We're looking for an increase week on week in one way or another. And the way that you progress that is individualized to your training age and kind of how much you're currently getting out of your training blocks.
Exactly. And again, comes back to feedback, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Comes back to, that individual feedback, being in touch with your clients, and the clients taking responsibility as well to take ownership of, of what they're doing, and to become aware of how they're feeling and how the training is affecting them. And that will come through experience as well as the athlete gets, more and more experience and more aware of the body, more aware of how they're reacting, more aware of like how they respond to volume, intensity, etc. And the coach is also learning as well as we go along with that individual as to, what we need to do and what responses we need to make.
One thing you also like to do with a mesocycle is it's like to like have a slightly different focus of like mentality going into sessions. So rather than, a horrible position to be in is you're going to your intro week, and we normally encourage people to be conservative with that introduction week. Set yourself a good standard, be conservative, allow a little room to progress, and like I said, get used to the exercises, the novelty of the rep schemes, etc. But if you start week 1 and you overshoot, and then you're chasing progress week on week, week 2 you overshoot again, week 3 you miss a rep, and then you're fucked. So I think like in terms of mentality coming into it, try and encourage like a conservative week 1, then week 2 is a nice steady progression, and then when you come into like your biggest weeks, which would be the last 2 weeks of the training block for most people, you start to increase like your arousal coming into the session. You start to increase like how psyched up you get into training. That will look different for different people, but at least your focus and your mentality going into these sessions has changed from, okay, I'm just trying to set a good standard to I'm trying to push things now. So I think also looking at your mentality going into these different weeks can also really help. And like almost the periodization of your mental approach to the training is quite important, I think.
If you're going for mad hype on week 1, and you're in a pickle, aren't you? There's nowhere to go then. So interesting, you were talking about this the other day with your own training and the hype aspect.
Yes, on a deload.
Yeah,
on a deload week, I never put any music on that I like. I just try and relax, and then you also get like a natural drop then. So if you're aiming at like a 7 RPE, we speak about keeping the intensity roughly the same on a deload, which would be the same for myself. But if I change my mentality going into it, it'll be a natural drop. So I'm still working around that 7 RPE mark, but I'm just making sure that I'm not massively psyched up and most importantly, but not burning out, ready for the start of a new block. Like I'm trying to, with the deal, facilitate recovery. And even though the session might still be high intensity, based off the RPE, if I go in all guns blazing, psyched up, then I'm not going to set myself up and be recovered, ready to start the new block, which is more important.
If you're going into a session on week 1, full of Monster energy drink and sort of dancing around the place, music blaring, psych yourself up and shouting, and there's nowhere to go on comp day, is there, or on a heavy lifting day or anything like that. That's the standard.
You haven't got that extra 2-3% of having a bit more caffeine, of getting super psyched up, of getting your favourite music on, which we all know has a little bit of a training boost. If you're doing that, that's the standard, and anytime you come away from that, you've got nothing else to offer. So I definitely think like the mentality and the weeks can also progress as with the training load and stimulus.
Absolutely. So we talked about the meso there and like the progression week to week. What about in the macro, so the progression from block to block?
So we had this is a good one to talk about because on Monday a couple of people asked questions about this and like how at the minute we're focusing on very much like it's very hypertrophy specific training. We mentioned this before in previous podcasts that we've massively moved away now from having a block where you're doing hypertrophy and then strength and then power. We try and have aspects of all of these, but the percentages and the focus changes from one to another. So at the minute we're in a hypertrophy focus block, which is slightly higher repetition sets, but we still have some top end strength work in there as well. It's not the priority, but we're looking to at least maintain the strength, maintain the skill of doing higher intensity sets, but then really try and prioritize your volume work. This for 2 reasons is like when you then go to your strength work, it's not completely alien to yourself. You've still been able to maintain that skill, but also there's good research that shows that doing a fairly submaximal top set prior to volume set can actually increase your potential to perform more volume. So it works in two ways. But yeah, so when we're in a hypertrophy block, we still got that little bit of dosage of strength. We then really focus on the hypertrophy and we have a very small dose of conditioning as well, depending on the people's goal. Moving further into more like strength orientated blocks, the dosages just change of everything. So we go from having 1 or 2 sets of your strength work to then the majority of your work is your strength. And then your hypertrophy, we're just looking to kind of maintain the minimum amount of volume that you would need to kind of maintain the hypertrophy that you've built. So again, we're not going from doing like 15 working sets between the 8 to 12 rep scheme to then doing none. We maybe go from like doing 4 strength sets and 10 volume sets to maybe switching the other way around. So you go from maintaining one aspect to prioritizing the other to then switching it around into the next block. We're not trying to just get rid of everything and then go back into a volume block and almost starting it again. So
yeah, that's the key, isn't it? It's not going from 0 to turbo like, you know, in 1 week or 1 block. Yeah. So it's always keeping a minimal dose of, you know, other components. So as you know, as you've said, like we might be looking block 1 quite a hypertrophy focus, but we're using what we call vertical integration. So we're working, you know, all the different components, but hypertrophy is just a focus. That's the main thing. But if we neglect strength work completely, then obviously strength levels can drop off, but also it's too much of a jump up when we get into the second block and the third block. If all of a sudden all we've done is, you know, 8s, 10s, 12s, you know, a moderate intensity to all of a sudden say, right, we've got to lift heavy now. Yeah. You're not putting yourself in the optimal position. You're not used to, you know, training on the nerve at all. You're not used to training heavy. You're not used to heavier loads.
Even though you're doing the same lift, there is a skill and there is it's a different mentality going into higher intensity work. Like Marcus, you say, if you do 1 set a week for your squat of strength orientated work where you're working like even 80 to 85%, that just bridges the gap then to when you're doing all of your strength work around that 87% mark. Yeah. You're already there. It's not completely aimed to yourself. Yeah. With your hypertrophy work, if you're working sets of 8, you're going to be around that 70 to 75% mark. Yeah. All of a sudden that jump to 85%, that extra 10% is massive heavy. And it feels incredibly heavy on the back. Yeah. And it can also like forget about the physical, like mentally going into it. When you're used to doing 8 to 100 kilo, if all of a sudden you're doing 110, 115 kilo for a set of 4 or 5, adding that amount of weight is mentally can be quite daunting. Sure. So it's a way of also like mentally keeping yourself like in the game and not being scared of doing these sessions, which are hard sessions in a different way to the volume.
Yeah, take a back squat, for example, like just even, you know, like you say 1 set or 2 sets at 82, 85%, you know, just getting used to the weight of that bar, you know, the feeling on the back of unracking that and walking back, you know, and starting that descend in the squat. If you're going blind and you've been doing everything, you've been doing 70, 75% work, unracking that bar feels horrendous. Yeah. So, you know, it's, like I say, you know, we want to train, you know, strength and, you know, sort of almost maximal strength, you know, all year round, or at least pretty much all year round. All we're doing is changing the amount that we're doing, the dosage. So, you know, that's obviously what we're looking for with most programs with a Barbell Club, especially as, like you say, hypertrophy focus at the moment, and then we'll gradually shift that focus towards maximal strength. We built a good foundation. We've, you know, potentially built a little bit of muscle mass with certain people. We've, you know, got used to the skill acquisition at lower intensities, so we can build. But again, just keep, you know, still keeping your 1 set of 4 or your 1 set of 5, you know, and then your back offs. So again, good mix of like a little bit of intensity, but a lot of volume. And then we can switch those two over as we build, you know, towards, you know, testing some maxes or whatever it might be. We'll cross that over. So like you say, you know, all of a sudden, you know, we get into block 2, we shift the focus. By the time we get into our third meso, then, you know, we're doing the majority of our work is going to be that top end strength work, minimizing the you know, the back off work. So that's it's like that in barbell. And then interestingly, like with, you know, with sports, it's a similar thing, isn't it? So like with, you know, with the field athletes, for example, you know, apologies, I always use rugby as an example, but it obviously just, you know, comes naturally. But what we're looking for, you know, in a big off-season, pre-season plan is, you know, it might be a hypertrophy focus at the beginning, but again, the key is it's the focus. It's not the be-all and end-all. It's not everything. So, you know, that old school block periodization of doing, 4 weeks of hypertrophy into 4 weeks of strength into 4 weeks of power conversion into 4 weeks of speed, the science has shown us now, over the last decade or two, that it's not the most effective way to train. You want to train everything all year round, and all you're doing is change mixing the dosages up. So even during that hypertrophy focus, I'm doing something similar to what we do in Barbell Club. So I'm doing like 1 or 2, still fairly heavy sets. It might not be above 85%, but it might be 78, 82%, around that kind of range. Am I really too bothered about plyometric work and speed at that point? 3 or 4 months out from the season, the answer is no. But do I want to lose it? No. Do I want to, and it's not just about losing it as well. It's like building that base, before you up the intensity of that. So, for example, like most people realize, like just before the season, you obviously want to be building a lot of velocity work, a lot of plyometrics, a lot of speed work. And again, what you don't want to be doing is like having done none of that for 3 months and then all of a sudden trying to do loads of it, because you're going from nothing to an absolute shitload in too short a period of time. And that's where the body's going to break down, because we've not built up any tissue tolerance. We're not used to that exposure, like of, for example, like high level plyometrics or anything like that. So what you're doing in those blocks is, even if it's hypertrophy focus and we want to put on a couple of pounds and want to, build a bit of muscle mass, I might be doing like, 2 sets of, one set of 10 pogo jumps at the beginning of my session, just to keep that, elasticity, to keep that, to keep that stimulus. I'll go into block 2 and it's like hypertrophy focus, but strength ramping up a little bit. So I start to do 2 sets of 4 or 2 sets of 5, and then my back offs. And with my plyo stuff, I'm doing my pogos, and I'm starting to do 3 sets of 3 box jump at a low level, or whatever it might be, or banded broad jump, or a banded, lateral hop or something like that. So there's a minimal stimulus. And then as we build, we've got that crossover that we talked about between hypertrophy and strength with the Barbell Club program. And it's exactly the same in sport, where it's like, okay, my position needs to be quite powerful. That's probably the biggest thing. Speed, I need to be pretty quick, but the main thing's the power. So I start ramping the focus up before that, but I've not done nothing. I've not done no power. So that when the time comes where it's like, right, I've got that month to really smash my power work, I'm not starting from nothing and just a bodybuilding type hypertrophy program or a static strength program. I've still been a little bit dynamic. I've still done some power stuff with the med balls, or I've done some, I've done some Olympic lifting technique or some throws or whatever it might be. And it's like, right, okay, this is my power window now. I've got a good base, a good foundation, and I can go all in with no risk of injury. I'm not jumping, like we said about the mesocycles of going like week 1, week 2, week 3, like a pyramid and progressive. I'm not going like, in the macro, I'm not going like from one meso to another, of going like 0 plyo to shitloads of plyo. It's like I'm building as we're going along, and I'm slowly bringing down the other stuff so that my overall training stimulus isn't too much.
Yeah. I think that's spot on. Yeah, it's the same with a strength athlete as well. Hypertrophy focus, that little bit of dosage of the top end strength, really focus on your hypertrophy. And then when you come into your strength, you don't want to lose your muscle mass that you've built up. You want to, do the, like I said, probably the minimum to maintain that, and really then focus on your strength. So you'll be doing your low repetition, higher intensity sets, which we know are most important for strength. And then just because we know that the low rep work can also work for hypertrophy, you might just need a couple of sets of like slightly easier volume work compared to doing 3 or 4 hard sets of 8. It might be 2 easy sets of 6, which is a lower dosage, but it's enough to maintain at least the muscle mass that you've built, and then really prioritize and keeping you fairly fresh then going into your strength training. And like I said, it's just about selecting what's the most important overarching principle, and what's the overarching goal of the cycle. For yours, it was to improve your strength. So you're doing the minimum to maintain and set yourself up for the next block. And that's the same with powerlifting. The focus is, I've got a competition coming up, so top end intensity is the priority, but I want to maintain my muscle mass, because thinking of the bigger picture and long-term goals, you want to maintain that. Do the lowest dose that you can pretty much to keep your muscle mass. And then you set yourself up into a position that when you come back to a volume focus, your conditioning's still there. Like you've said, you're still able to tolerate that amount of work, and you're ready to progressively build things back up and progress what you did compared to your last volume block.
Yeah, you're not like as a powerlifter, you're not going into your big intensity block and comp prep by doing like 3 singles. Or 3 sets of 3 or whatever. You're still doing a little bit of back off work. You're still doing your accessory work. Although the focus now has obviously changed to more top end strength. That's not to neglect everything else we're doing.
Exactly. An example might be that, like during a hypertrophy block, I might do a top set on deadlift, let's say 3 or 4 reps around that 85% mark, a couple of sets around 80, and then my volume work is based around stiff leg deadlift at the minute, where I'll do like 2 or 3 hard sets of stiff leg deadlift. Like I said, I've asked him to reduce that because it was tough, so it's 2 sets now. But then coming into my next training block where I'm getting ready for a competition in July, I'll be doing presumably 2 or 3 top end sets, and then it'll be 1 or 2 easier volume focus or high repetition sets. So it might be stiff leg deadlift for 2 sets of 6 compared to 2 sets of 8, and I imagine the weight will be roughly the same, so that means that the RP is going to be a little bit lower as well. So that means then that I'm not going to be completely beat up going into my next session, and I'm still able to perform high quality, high intensity work. So you're still doing the same exercises, still doing fairly similar reps again, but the dosages has just changed ever so slightly, and that's all it needs.
Fantastic. Yeah. I think to round up then, we've hopefully given the Barbell Club guys there some information on why, method behind the madness and why we do what we do, and, to let them know that everything's planned, everything's structured in a certain way to get the best out of them. Hopefully this will encourage them to keep giving us feedback as well. But also people who are members of MSC hopefully have taken a lot from that, in terms of how to structure a training program, how to, communicate with the coach.
And I guess as well, just not to automatically presume that, like, if you've asked for an individual program and it looks fairly similar to someone else that does a similar sport to yourself, that's not lazy coaching. That's because you both got overarching similar goals, but the individualities, the nitty gritty, the small details, and they should be reflected within your training program. But your training program should look fairly similar to each other, but just these individual differences. So
absolutely.
Say no more.
Bloody lovely. Right. Okay. I think we'll round up there. Anything else? Or happy?
No, I guess just to say, we've got a strongman comp coming up.
We certainly have.
For the Metcon Games Volume 2.
Metcon Games Volume 2, yeah.
Which the rumour is that all of the coaches will be taking part in some respects. That's very exciting. So just keep an eye out for that. Obviously, if you're interested in individualised programming, you can get in touch with myself or Mark via the website, via the Instagram, or if you're looking to get part of the Barbell Club, you can inquire through a consultation through the website as well. But apart from that, if you have any questions or anything like that, just fire them over via an email or via DMs on Instagram, and we'll try and get back to you as best as we can. If you've got any suggestions for further podcasts, please let us know, and any feedback is appreciated.
Excellent. Thanks for tuning in, guys. We'll catch you next time. Cheers.